Thanks, Mokhtar and Chico, for those very stimulating comments. And I'm going to try to maybe bring some of those themes into my own talk. I'm Ted Miguel. I'm a professor of economics here at Berkeley and the faculty director for the Center for Effective Global Action. And I just want to start off by saying how thankful we are to the World Bank for partnering with us on this conference. It's a tremendous lineup. We have papers I know I'm going to learn a lot from, and this partnership between Berkeley and the bank is really something special. I've had the pleasure of working with Mokhtar for quite a while. When he was country director of the World Bank in Kenya, we worked together, and we continue to work together, and he's a great friend, and it's just a pleasure to work together with him on this. Dave Evans and I, who's been involved in the organization, we have a lot of fieldwork adventures we could talk about. We were in grad school together, and it's great to be joining forces with you and Chico and the whole World Bank team, and I know everybody at SIGA is just really delighted with how everything's gone so far. I also want to thank the SIGA team for putting together another great and well-organized event, and the food wasn't our fault. I'm just going to say that. This is really an exceptional forum. Just a word about the conference. ABCA has an incredible lineup. And one of the things that's so striking about it that I really loved in seeing the program was how interdisciplinary it is. There's a lot of political science work, historical work. There are geographers. There are, of course, economists. There are those with development studies backgrounds. And everybody's come together to tackle this incredibly important issue of conflict. And I know we're going to learn a lot from each other. The other critical part of this equation is that we have high-level policymakers in the room. And the conversation about policy among scholars and policymakers is something really unique about this forum, and I think it's going to be extremely productive. So I'm really excited to attend sessions, and it's just a tremendous honor to be the speaker here this morning. Let me start with a little bit of background, and Chico's touched on some of these issues. Civil war, other forms of organized violence are not some idle concern in sub-Saharan Africa. They're extremely widespread. If we look over the last 30 years or so, 80% of African countries have had at least 1 year of civil conflict. Many have had long-lasting civil wars, including in some of the largest and most important countries, if we think of Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. So this is an issue that's ubiquitous and something, if we're going to study African development, we have to study conflict. And if you're not sort of putting it front and center, you're really missing a huge part of the equation. And just to sort of make it concrete and make it also personal for me in terms of a place where I've done field work, consider the case of Sierra Leone, a relatively small country that suffered from a brutal civil war from 1991 to 2002. During that time, 1 million people were displaced, at least 50,000 were killed. There was tremendous human cost, and physical violence, sexual violence, declines in health measures, declines in educational measures, just in every dimension you can measure well-being, lives improved. And then in the kind of summary measure that economists turn to, GDP per capita, there was a just staggering decline according to official figures. Now, I don't know how good that data is, and we could debate where the numbers come from, but Sierra Leone was already one of the few poorest countries in the world before the war, and then after the war it was just devastated. And having done field work at least in a few countries, I've never seen the kind of visible malnutrition and just visible desperation as Sierra Leone right after the civil war there when I started working. It was demoralizing. And of course there's nothing unique about Sierra Leone. We could talk about the millions dead in DRC and Sudan and other conflicts, and then some of the more recent forms of violence that Chico was emphasizing. Of course, people in that period after the war are forced to pick up the pieces and try to put together their lives, their children's lives, their homes, their businesses, rebuild, and reimagine their society as well. And that's one of the interesting pieces of hope in that equation, is the possibility of improving things the next time around. So what I want to start with is this big theme, and I think this is a theme that sort of permeates the conference today. I'm going to talk about some of the latest research on the issue of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, bringing in evidence from other regions at times. And the question in our mind that I'm going to try to come back to a few times is, what's the role of policy in this? What are the roles of policy reforms, of institutional reforms? What's the way forward if we want to think about concrete ways to make a difference. And as I was looking through the program last night, I was trying to think about types of studies, or if we wanted to classify studies. It seemed to me on the program here there's tremendous studies. A lot of them fall roughly in three camps. There's a sort of first group of studies that's interested in the consequences of violence and conflict, trying to understand either the short run or in some cases really exciting evidence now on the longer term effects of conflict on human capital and growth, on institutions. These are very useful studies. There's a second group of studies that tries to dig deep into the causes of conflict. What are the triggers? Where does it come from? How much of it is economic versus sociological or political factors, or maybe the interaction of these factors? Of course, that's a very important set of studies if we ever want to craft solutions. We have to understand the causes. The third broad set of studies, and I'm going to sort of focus on these for my talk today, is studies that are directly linked to solutions of some kind, a policy response that maybe dampens the risk of conflict, or maybe reduces some of the consequences and effects of conflict. So I'm going to talk about some of those studies here, and I think this is a really intellectually innovative area. It's actually, I think, one of the most interesting sub-themes in development economics as a whole right now is the creative use of economics and other social sciences to try to make a dent in violence. And at least for us in economics, this is a departure from what we usually study traditionally, but it's becoming a mainstream topic. The promise of this whole research agenda in finding solutions is the deep hope that somehow, if we put our minds to it and we get the best data and the best research possible, and we communicate that in forums like these with policymakers, that we can make a difference. That there's going to be some policy change in some setting or some country that does reduce the risk of conflict even a little bit. And that's the goal of this meeting in some sense. So today I'll talk about some of what we've learned in this area. I'm going to focus, there's a lot of factors driving violence, and Chico and Mokhtar touched on several of them. I'll come back to some at the end, but I'm going to focus on two in particular for the talk today. I'm going to talk about climate change, the risk of climate, and second, ethnic divisions. So two big themes in the African political economy literature and themes that I've worked on. So you're all aware of the economic turnaround in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 15 to 20 years. Chico alluded to the growth rates. Mokhtar alluded to the growth rates. 4% isn't 5 or 6, but it's a hell of a lot better than -2. And that's sort of what the 70s and 80s look like. But there's a troubling issue on the horizon for sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the risk of climate change. All the climate models out there and the climate scientists out there predict the world is going to warm. It's going to warm by at least 2 degrees Celsius, maybe more. And there are profound implications of a warming of 2 or 3 degrees Celsius for the global economy, including in sub-Saharan Africa. There are particularly important implications for sub-Saharan Africa because so much of the population and so much of the economy relies on rain-fed agriculture. Irrigation is less widespread than in many parts of Asia. In many countries, the majority of population still has some hand in agriculture. So when the crops fail, their livelihoods are at risk. And there are potentially very important implications for social and political stability of that change. There's a growing body of evidence by many scholars, some in this room, about the links between climatic changes and variation and economic conditions. There's work by David Lobel and Marshall Burke at Stanford and Wolfram Schlenker at Columbia, drawing out the incredibly tight historical link between an increase of 1 degree Celsius on crop yields in sub-Saharan Africa. So in the hottest regions of sub-Saharan Africa, 1 degree Celsius increase has a big impact on crop production. That's an average increase of 1 degree. Of course, an average increase of 1 degree means there are a much higher proportion of days that are very hot, and so those very hot days that have a very bad effect on crop growth. There's also a growing body of evidence that even non-agricultural production and productivity falls when it's hot. That's true in the U.S. So in the U.S., when it's hot, production falls. It's true in Europe. It's true in sub-Saharan Africa. Labor productivity is lower as it gets hotter. So that's what we have to deal with looking forward. So let me survey some work that I've done with co-authors Marshall Burke and Solomon Shang. Some of you are familiar with. We have a kind of latest kind of piece of work in this area that's coming out in the Annual Review of Economics that's putting together all the latest studies on this link between climate and conflict and violence. There are many possible channels. I'll talk about some of them in a minute. Our goal in this survey was to assemble all the evidence we could find across disciplines. So very much like this room and this conference here today, not just economics, political science, history, even some long-term historical studies, paleoclimate studies, I learned that term, criminology, and assembled all the data that we could. And what we did, the sort of condition we used for incorporating data into the study, was we wanted to focus on panel data. So data that has information on multiple locations over multiple time points, so we could use modern econometric methods with fixed effects, and we could account for any fixed differences across time and across locations, and understand how variation in climate increases violence and conflict risk in those data sets. And again, there's over 40 data sets actually in these 60 studies. One of the things that we did is for about 14 of the studies, or 15 of the studies now, we reanalyzed the data. So some of the authors who had assembled this interesting data hadn't used kind of standard econometric methods like fixed effects and other types of controls. So we reanalyzed the data, put it all in the same statistical framework, and try to draw a general conclusion across all of these studies. This is a very new literature. There's a lot of new studies on the program here at ABCA that are building on this and contributing to this literature. The median year of the studies in this literature is 2011, so it's just a few years old. And when we put it together, we find a very striking pattern, which is that higher temperatures and more extreme rainfall are strongly linked to more conflict. And that includes civil war, that includes militia violence, that includes crime, that includes murder from studies in the U.S. Now, actually, Mokhtar alluded to this study on witch killing in Tanzania, so I'm just going to show the data for this study and make the link. This study is how I got interested in this topic. I was doing field work in Tanzania, studying something else. Actually, I was studying local public finance issues, ethnic divisions, and really the topic of my focus in that project was how Tanzanian national institutions help bridge ethnic divides and dampen ethnic divisions in Tanzania. And people who have worked in East Africa know about the importance of those institutions. So I was studying that. And the thing that people talked about and that I heard about and then we started collecting data on was just how widespread killing of witches was in this area. In this part of western Tanzania where we worked, Meatu district is a hotbed for witch killing. And these witches tend to be old women. Sometimes they're widows, sometimes they're not. They tend to be from the poorest families in the poorest areas. And they tend to be attacked and killed in the most desperate years. And that's what you can see in the right-hand side panel. The left here is the location of the villages. The right-hand side panel, the x-axis is the temperature anomaly, in a regression with fixed effects. And the y-axis is the increase in witch killings. When it gets hot and dry in this part of Tanzania, witch killings increase dramatically. Now, when you talk to people about the cause of witch killing in this part of Tanzania, there's a very close link between these attacks and some traditional religious beliefs and notions about these witches harming others in the community. So in these bad years, they're blamed for bad things that are going on. But there's a very strong economic underpinning to what's going on. Desperate economic conditions trigger this kind of violence. And it's violence of the most desperate people in the most desperate part of Tanzania. And it's not and this gets back to, I think, directly to Mokhtar's point. There's nothing that we can't begin to try to understand as social scientists in this setting. There's nothing exotic necessarily about this. There's a social system, a set of religious beliefs, but very important economic underpinnings to what's going on. Other scholars have looked at related issues. This is data from another project. The left panel shows all the different pixels of data across 9 East African countries. This is data by O'Loughlin et al. That came out in the proceedings of the National Academy. And the right-hand side is the same sort of plot I showed you before, where the x-axis is a temperature deviation, the y-axis is violence. Here, violence is a bit broader. The O'Loughlin data has not just civil war or civil conflict violence. They have militia violence. They have organized cattle raids. So any form of organized violence. So it's a bit closer. Chico was saying there's new types of violence emerging. This is actually a very comprehensive data set that captures those. And you can see this very strong relationship again. When it gets hotter in East Africa, more violence across the board. And here actually, just to describe the right-hand side panel a little bit more, the shaded area is the 95% confidence interval in a non-parametric regression. So that's why the shape isn't strictly linear. And here, a 1 degree Celsius warming is associated with about 20% increase in violence. It's a huge effect. Remember, we're talking about maybe a 2 degree Celsius increase going forward. So there's dozens of these studies. I already said there's 60 of them. Let me just put a few more. These are African studies. The third study, the one in blue, is some work of mine with Marshall Burke and other co-authors looking at civil war and the link between temperature and civil war. You see the same increasing relationship. The right-hand side of the panel, the green one, is a study by my co-author, Sol Shang. It's a study by my co-author, Sol Shang. I'm not on that paper. And his co-authors, which looks at the increase in violence as a result of the El Nino and La Nina cycle. People may be familiar with El Nino, this cyclical warming. It's called El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO is the abbreviation used in climate science. So there's an ENSO cycle. And it turns out in the warming phase of ENSO, there's a big increase in civil war risk. And that's what this is showing. So the increase in temperature driven by El Nino increases civil war. Almost a quarter of all civil war starts, civil war onsets, can be explained by the El Nino cycle around the globe over the last 50 years. It's a striking finding. El Nino is very exciting to study for those of us interested in climate change too, because El Nino is a sort of predictable, or at least somewhat predictable cycle. You know it's going to happen in the next few years, and it's a global climate phenomenon. So it affects the whole world. So it's closer to helping us understand what global climate change might do. There's also brand new research I wanted to mention that I've just found out about recently by James Fenske, who's here, and co-authors at Oxford, looking at a very similar relationship in the historical period in sub-Saharan Africa. So James has a great new paper using data from colonial French West Africa. He got the temperature data, he got the rainfall data, and he finds that in the first half of the 20th century, in hot years and dry years, there's a spike in anti-colonial unrest and riots and resistance in colonial French West Africa. And again, so this isn't just a product of one time period or whatnot. It's something that's quite general. Okay, so this is the last of these beautiful watercolor figures. You'll see for a while. I like them too. They're beautiful. I want to hang it on my wall. This is my co-author's sort of invention. So when we pull together all these temperature studies, at last count, actually, we didn't even include James's work and the other work on the program here. We're probably over 30 studies now, but all the studies we've found, the published and working paper studies that look at the link between high temperature and violence, every single one of them finds a positive relationship. So this is incredibly unlikely to occur by chance. If this were a zero relationship, you flipped a coin 27 or 30 times, the chance you'd get 30 heads out of 30 heads is, 1 in many million. So there's something, deep going on here. And this, I want to just come back to Mokhtar's point. The studies that we look at aren't only from sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at violence in Brazil, land invasions, it turns out they're much more likely to happen in extreme rainfall years. If you look at Hindu-Muslim rioting in India, it turns out they're more likely to occur in extreme rainfall years as well. Crime rates go up in the U.S. in very hot months, so there's even a very short-term response. So whether it's the U.S. or Australia or India or Brazil, and then a lot of the data is also from Africa, we find this relationship. And the fact that this pattern occurs in so many settings actually points the way towards an understanding of mechanisms, and that's something very important to keep in mind. There's in a setting like Tanzania, the setting that I studied before, and a number of the other African or Indian settings, the economic channel seems very important. The fact that when it's hot and dry, crops fail, and people are poor, almost certainly contributes to this violence. And actually, there's some new papers that show what really matters in driving violence in East Africa, some of these multi-country studies, is how hot and dry it was 6 months ago during the growing season, not right now. Whereas the non-growing season temperatures don't matter. So there's clearly some link between growing season conditions and later violence. So an economic channel's there, but there's also almost certainly some sort of neuropsychological, neurophysiological channel at play. The fact that on a hot day or a hot week in the U.S. there's more crime suggests that the link between high temperature and violence can't just be economic. It isn't that people's income drops in a hot week in the U.S. And there's actually some promising evidence, and with co-authors we've actually started doing a bit more work on this topic and investigating what's going on. There's a growing body of evidence in psychology making the link between various neurotransmitters and violence. And it turns out a number of neurotransmitters, including serotonin, which is a very important regulator of behavior, are closely linked to temperature. So when it gets hot, serotonin production falls in an effort by the brain to keep brain temperature down. Of course, the brain temperature has to be very closely regulated by the body. But dropping serotonin, lower serotonin levels, are linked to all kinds of behavioral change. Psychologists have linked it in particular to impulsive aggression. So you can already see that the kind of scientific links are possible there. But a lot more work needs to be done to fully understand the channels, and that's going to be a very important part of the story. Okay, so just to wrap up the discussion on climate, then I'll turn to the second piece of my discussion. One thing that we can do is take all those studies and take all that data that I've showed you and think about the implications for climate change. Now, it turns out that we don't know exactly what the world's going to look like in 30 years or 40 years. That's a pretty hard thing to do. But what we can do is make a simple assumption that the world's reaction or society's reaction to high temperature and extreme rainfall will look similar, say, in 20 years as it has historically. So we make that assumption in this figure. And what you can see in a figure like this is there's actually going to be a lot of temperature increase in sub-Saharan Africa, especially some areas of the Sahel, some areas of the Horn of Africa, also really spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And that's a tremendous risk factor given the data that we've shown. There's also going to be a lot of warming in South Asia. I mean, you can see many parts of the tropics are going to warm a lot. But the implication, if the historical patterns go forward, is in tropical regions of the world, average conflict could go up by as much as 40% if historical patterns continue in terms of the response of violence to temperature. This is a terrifying thought. I already showed you how widespread conflict is in sub-Saharan Africa. So risk is going to increase, and we need to do something about it. We need to think about solutions. So in some ways, this is a very bleak result, terrifying result. It's almost overwhelming to think about what the world will look like with these kinds of increases in violence in a world that already has way too much violence. How can public policy respond to some threat of this magnitude? There's actually some growing evidence on solutions that I want to touch on, and a number of the people who have worked on this are in the room. Can we target social programs to make a difference here? And in particular, if we think that a lot of the violence is perpetrated by a particular group, is there something we can do to try to reduce that violence? And of course, the violence, most of the violence, civil war violence, crime, etc., is perpetrated by young or middle-aged men. So maybe they're a group to think about. And what I want to talk about in particular is a new paper. This is an unpublished paper by Timo Fetzer, who just finished his PhD at LSE. He was just on the job market this year. This is a very important paper. He studies this issue in a different setting, but I think we can learn a lot from this setting. He studies it in India, another low-income setting. Parts of India have a civil conflict environment that actually looks similar to parts of sub-Saharan Africa. In particular, in the eastern part of India, there's been a long-standing insurgency, the Naxalite insurgency, these Marxist insurgents who have been at it for decades. They're working in multiple states. There's been thousands killed. And we can learn something from the Indian case. The first thing that Fetzer does is he documents that extreme rainfall is associated with more violence in India. He first documents that relationship, just like the relationship that I've showed you. And I lied, there are more of these beautiful figures, but he made these. We didn't make these. So this is what Fetzer does. Let me explain this top panel. The left-hand panel, I know that the writing may be a little small. The left-hand panel in green, the x-axis, is the monsoon rains. So more monsoon rains in this eastern part of India are good. They're good for production. You can see in the y-axis here, agricultural production rises pretty linearly with the monsoon rains. More rain is good, less rain is bad. And that translates in the middle panel pretty one-to-one to agricultural income. So agricultural earnings are good when the monsoon is good, and they're bad when the monsoon is bad. So this is a climate shock. It's an agricultural shock. It's an income shock. But what you can see in the rightmost panel, here the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the amount of conflict, Naxalite conflict. That's falling with the monsoon rains. So in other words, when economic conditions are better, there's less Naxalite violence. So this is just like the plots that I showed you before. But that's just the beginning of the story. India, about 10 years ago, rolled out the world's largest public works program, the world's largest employment program, NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. NREGA started in 2005. Every month it employs tens of millions of people. So it just blows away any social program you could imagine elsewhere. Over 100 million people have worked in the program at some point in the last decade. I read these numbers, I'm like, what? Yes. And they actually employ people of all ages and genders, but a large fraction of those employed are young or middle-aged young men. This target group for us. So Fetzer asks a very simple question. When you roll out a massive social program that provides some basic income for the poor and places a floor before their income. So the way NREGA is set up is if you want a job, you're going to get a job. There's supposed to be no rationing to these jobs. So in a desperate year, you can go and you're guaranteed. That's why it's a guarantee scheme, NREGA, the G there. You'll get a job. What happens when you put a floor below the income of these at-risk groups? Are they less likely to turn to violence and live a peaceful life? And actually, that's exactly what he finds. So if you look at the same three panels, you still see that when the monsoon is good, agricultural production goes up. There's something fundamental there about the plant biology. But the middle panel on the bottom is flat now. In other words, even in bad years, income looks the same. Because now, when the rains fail, I go to NREGA and I have the same income. So there's a major degree of income smoothing because of this program in the districts that got NREGA. So here this is a difference in difference where he's comparing those that got NREGA to those who had not yet gotten it. And what you can see in the right-hand side panel with the Naxalite violence, yes, it's still downward sloping, but it's no longer significant. It's much weaker. The slope has dampened a lot. So this is a major social program targeting this at-risk group that dampened violence in a decades-long conflict. This is a very encouraging finding when we think about the role that public policy could play in dampening violence and conflict. It's a very important paper. So that's one type of program, rural employment program. There's other programs out there, and some are going to be discussed here today. I want to just highlight, there's a series of papers actually by Chris Blattman and co-authors, some in Uganda, some in Liberia. And actually it's interesting, we heard the point from Mokhtar about urban violence and urban crime. A bunch of these folks, if I understand from Chris, are actually living in urban areas. He's studying ex-combatants in Liberia who had fought in the Liberian Civil War, who are now, some are in urban areas, some are in rural areas. The goal of this program was to try to intervene with these ex-combatants to make sure they don't go back to violence. And it's a great data collection operation that Chris put together. They ask about a whole range of different activities, borderline illegal activities, illicit activities, legal activities, to try to get a sense of how these guys are spending their time. And it turns out that when you get job training and you get some capital and you get some counseling and life coaching to try to help change people's identity and self-image, they're much less likely to be engaged in illicit activities and more likely to be doing things like having a farming business or another small business. So this is a working paper, very exciting finding to think that you can target programs, this is through an RCT, and reduce violence. And I know many of you in the room are familiar with other programs aimed at ex-combatants. So I think there's hope that these programs really can have a big effect. There's another thing I want to mention, though, and this is really creative data. In addition to asking about employment issues, they also asked something very interesting. At the time the survey was going on, the civil war in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast, was still ongoing. So they asked the question, how interested are you in maybe going to fight as a mercenary in Ivory Coast? No, you might say there's some self-reporting issues there. Let's put those aside for a second. They tried to make, if you read the paper, make the data collection private and create trust and all those kinds of things. The people who received this program were far less likely to want to go fight in Cote d'Ivoire. So when we think about the spillovers and the contagion and whatnot, geez, if Liberia can solve their ex-combatant issues and get these guys to work productively, not only is it better for Liberia, it may affect regional stability. There may be a huge incentive when we think about the negative externality of having ex-combatants floating around in a region, a justification for big investments in these programs. I think, in reading these papers, and again, Chris may talk about some of them more, the thing I felt in reading, and this is sort of soft and fuzzy, but in addition to the training and the counseling, I felt like these programs gave the ex-combatants some measure of hope that they could lead a normal life. And that matters for people. It's incredibly powerful to feel hope. So these are just two studies. We're going to hear about more of them in ABCA. There's some very exciting work in this area that I think we can all learn from. Okay, so climate change. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the second topic. I'm going to focus on ethnic divisions. Ethnic and social divisions have long been considered a central issue in African political economy. The starting point for a lot of this literature is the finding by many data sets that sub-Saharan Africa is the world's most ethnically and linguistically diverse region. If we look at diversity based on the most common measure, ethno-linguistic fractionalization, ELF, we look at the distribution of ELF in African countries and non-African countries, just to have a cut. And I don't know if Eric Sue is here, but Eric, I want to thank him for helping me make all these great figures. The median African country has an ELF of 0.8. So what does that mean in English? That means the median African country, in terms of diversity, is as diverse as a country with about 5 major, equally sized ethnic groups. That's basically what an ELF of 0.8 means. The median non-African country is at about 0.2. What that means is a country with one dominant majority ethnic group, and then some smaller minority groups. That's a huge difference in terms of the typical country in sub-Saharan Africa and in other regions. African countries, on average, are just much more diverse, and there's a lot of reasons for that diversity. There are historical reasons. Some go back to Africa's geography. Others have linked it to implications of the slave trade. Others have linked it very, I think, convincingly to certain aspects of colonial divide and conquer policies. So there's a range of reasons why there is this ethno-linguistic mosaic, but it's something that's very important for development today. So the seminal paper in this area is the famous Easterly and Levine paper. Ross Levine, who's here at Berkeley's, very famous paper, cited many times, very influential. Their paper looks at data from the 60s to the 90s to 1990 and finds this negative downward sloping relationship you can see in the top part of the figure. The more diverse a country is, conditional on some other stuff, the slower is its growth. And if we sort of combine these two panels, you can see if we take that difference between the median African country and the median non-African country, that's a difference of about 0.6. And we multiply it by that slope, minus 1.7, on average during this period, African growth was about 1 percentage point lower in per capita terms over decades because of diversity, if we believe this analysis. Now, 1% over decades is huge. That translates into big differences in living standards over time. So this is potentially a big explanation for the divergence between the 60s and the 90s in African countries and other low-income countries. They also present some evidence in the paper as to what's going on, and they have evidence that various types of public policies are distorted in diverse countries, that it's harder to reach consensus, that there's less public goods investment or distorted public goods investment, really using mainly macro data, but bad policy seems to be the underpinnings of this relationship. So in some recent, there's actually a recent literature on this. Dan Posner of UCLA has done work on this. Others in the room have done work in trying to understand these policy distortions due to ethnic diversity. And with my co-authors, Robin Burgess, Remy Jedwab, Amit Morjaria, and Gerard Padra, we've also examined this issue, focusing on a particular sector, focusing on roads in Kenya, road building in Kenya, to try to understand this policy distortion. But beyond documenting the policy distortion, which I will, we're also very interested in the issue of what types of institutional environments might help dampen these distortions. And that's how it ties into this broad theme about dealing with conflict and dealing with fragility. Roads are a very important sector in Kenya. The single largest recurrent development expenditure by the central government is roads. In many countries, roads are a huge piece of the budget, or of the development budget, and they're very important economically. Roads connect regions within the country. They allow for trade across countries. They're just huge economic implications of roads. The other real advantage of roads, and part of the reason we chose roads is its analytical advantage, is we can see them. We know where they are. There's independent measures of where the roads are in like road maps. Whereas with lots of other government expenditures, if we actually tried to look at the health and education budget, it's kind of hard to pin down exactly where all that money's going. You can't see it as well. Sometimes you can with clinics or other things, but with roads you really see the end product. So this gave us a clear measurement advantage. And then what we did in this study is we characterized the ethnicity of different districts in Kenya. The vast majority of districts in Kenya have a single dominant ethnic group. So when a road is built in that district, we know the primary beneficiaries by ethnicity. So that was the analytical advantage and the reason why we chose roads. And you can see here some maps of the expansion of the road network. In the 60s, the road network this is the paved road network. There were some paved roads, but it was relatively sparse. There was a big increase in the 70s, if you stare at that map, another increase in the 80s. And then in the 90s, also a continued increase, although maybe not quite as much as before. Now, we've shaded in these areas deliberately. I hope you guys can see the green shaded areas are areas dominated by the Kikuyu ethnic group. The Kikuyu ethnic group is the single largest group, about a quarter of the population, and also the ethnic group of the first president of independent Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. And actually, he was in power from independence until 1978. You can actually see between 69 and 79, there's a lot of roads built in that green area. Just eyeballing it. Now, it turns out, so he dies in 78. From 78 to 2002, the next president was Daniel Arap Moi from the Kalenjin ethnic group, which is in the reddish region here. What you can actually see from 79 to 92 is a lot of roads were built in the reddish region. I mean, you can just eyeball it and see density in the areas where the presidents were ruling. Of course, Moi did lots of other things in the reddish region. Moi University, Moi Airport, and other things that were focused on his region. The patterns are maybe a little less clear between 92 and 2002. Our suspicion, our intuition in looking at the data came through in a more formal analytical approach. Here I'm going to show you some figures, but we have regressions in the paper that show the same patterns. What we're able to do is look at different districts of the country and define them as whether or not they are co-ethnic, meaning they share the ethnicity of the president at that moment or not. So there's co-ethnic districts and non-co-ethnic districts. The line at 1 here means your road funding is exactly proportional to your population. So that would be equal distribution around the country. So what you can see in this figure is, for large periods of time in Kenya's post-independence period, those blue co-ethnic areas are getting multiples of the road funding of the rest of the country, over 2, close to 3. And the red are the non-co-ethnic districts. So this comes through at 99% confidence in all the regressions. There's a big distortion of funding towards co-ethnic areas. They receive on average twice as much road funding during this period. But this isn't all we observe. There's actually an important political aspect to this. The shaded area in the middle is what we call the autocratic period, the non-democratic period. So from the 60s till 1970, Kenya formally had multi-party democracy. And again, alluding to the comment Mokhtar made about what maybe institutions meant that were inherited from the colonizers and whatnot, we can question the legitimacy of that constitution and those institutions. They didn't last very long. In many African countries, the sort of colonial institutions that were left in the early 60s were gone or at least some of them were changed quite quickly. But that was a relatively democratic period. Actually, you can see there wasn't this big blue line way above 1. After 92, we see the return of multi-party democracy, which strengthens over time. So you can see that blue line actually starts falling in the multi-party period, and then it bounces around. But on average, in the more democratic periods, before 1970, after 1992, the ratio, the blue line ratio, is much lower than it is in the autocratic period. It's actually not statistically different than 0. And the ratio in the autocratic period is 2.7-fold. So an even larger distortion in policy in the non-democratic period. So this is quite suggestive that democratic institutions helped constrain the worst policy biases. And there's a lot of reasons why. When you have a democracy, there's opposition lawmakers who can ask questions in parliament. Kenya has a very active media, television, newspapers. One of the things we did in this paper is just document how many more newspaper articles were written about roads projects after 1992, meaning how much independent scrutiny was there of all this spending. And the number of articles skyrockets after 1992. There's just a lot more focus by the public on these issues, and that can help bring about more accountability. So I'm not saying democracy solves all of Kenya's problems by any stretch, but it's a much more open country and a much more politically competitive country than it was before. One of the things you may be a little concerned about seeing this kind of data is omitted variables and all the kinds of identification concerns we worry about as social scientists. We deal with this in the paper in several ways. We have very rich control variables on various economic and geographic factors. Everything is fully robust to those. We did something else which was interesting is we actually simulated the road network if roads had just been built based on economic considerations alone. And we use a concept that's widely used in international trade, the concept of market potential. So a high market potential connection between two areas is a connection that connects high population areas that are close together. The idea being that's a very high return activity, whereas connecting sparsely populated areas that are far apart is sort of less of an obvious activity. So this is a concept that's widely used. And what we did is we took the total budget for roads in every year. We have that data for Kenya, year by year. But instead of allocating it the way it was historically, like in this top panel, we allocated it first to the highest market potential areas, then the second highest market potential areas, then the third highest market potential areas, until we exhausted the budget for that year. And we did that year by year. So we can simulate what the road network would look like just based on these economic considerations. And I think this is quite telling. So if you look at the bottom panel here over time and the evolution of the road network, it looks very different. The optimal road network here, based on economic considerations, has a much more radial structure, much more of a hub and spoke structure, connecting Nairobi to other big cities, connecting these major regional capitals to the port, etc. There's a lot more road construction towards the coast and the port, where there's a lot of population, but where historically there was almost no roads built. And you see this kind of all roads lead to Rome kind of structure. Big difference between the top panel and the bottom panel. One of the things that's nice to see is after democracy is reintroduced, multi-party democracy in 92, between 92 and 2002, you actually start seeing a bit of the radial structure of roads. Even in the actual data, you finally start seeing these roads out to far-flung regions. So it's almost like under democracy, road construction patterns look much more like the economically optimal patterns based on the simulation. Okay, so just a last finding, and then I'll wrap up. I want to come back to this issue of the effects of democracy. There's a lot of ways of defining democracy and many different aspects of it, but the trend is very clear in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan African countries today are much more democratic than they were, say, in the 70s and 80s. Huge shift. Here we've defined democracy, as some others have, using the polity measure. And this is a very generous definition. Polity takes on values from -10, meaning no political freedom, to +10, meaning as perfect a democracy as we could imagine. Here we're defining democracy as -5. So less than -5, and you're basically a one-party state, a military dictatorship, no political openness. Above -5, at least there's some political competition. So before Kenya reintroduced multi-party democracy in 1992, it was a -7. So the Moi and late Kenyatta eras were -7, and then after legalizing multi-parties, they went to -2. So that's the kind of shift that we're capturing here. And while in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, only about a third of countries met this definition, this very generous definition, today it's more like 90% of countries. So there's still a handful of countries that are true authoritarian dictatorships or military governments, but in most countries there's at least some political openness. So what happens to that Easterly and Levine relationship I showed you before? Remember, I showed you that downward sloping relationship. Well, we can divide up African countries. Now, this is just an Africa sample. Before it was the global sample. Into democracies, by this definition, and non-democracies. For the non-democracies, the same relationship holds as before, the Easterly and Levine relationship. Strong downward sloping relationship, even steeper than before, statistically significant. For the African democracies, it's basically flat. If anything, the slope is a little positive. It's not significant. So if we actually look at the Africa sample in this latest period, the Easterly and Levine relationship disappears. There's no longer, over the last few decades, a negative drag of ethnic diversity on growth in sub-Saharan Africa. And democracy provides a plausible explanation why, as a contributing factor. This isn't as cleanly identified as a perfect RCT. We can debate why countries switch into and out of democracy. But it's a very strong pattern, I think provocative, in thinking about what's going on. And in fact, again, reaching a bit beyond what the data could say with tremendous confidence, but I just want to point out the timing, which I think is instructive. This is the time plot of African per capita income. Everybody in this room who works on Africa has seen this in every presentation you've given. You all have this slide. And you can see this big turnaround in African per capita income starting in the mid-90s. There's a lot of reasons for it. It's a very active literature. commodity price changes and other changes. But maybe it's not a coincidence that the turnaround starts right in the early to mid-90s when this huge wave of democratization hits sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe this helped constrain the worst forms of policy biases, like the road spending in Kenya, or other forms of policy distortion. That accountability, by constraining the worst policy, may have played an important role here. Okay, so I've really just scratched the surface. I'm on my last slide here. There's so many other factors to think about. The conference, ABCA, is wonderful in seeing the panorama of factors and causes and consequences and issues we want to study. You know, as was mentioned by Chico and Mokhtar, there's the issue beyond climate change and ethnic divisions. There's growing Islamist insurgencies. There's countries grappling with sharp commodity price changes over the last year or two. This is an incredibly, potentially destabilizing factor in certain countries. There are other factors to keep in mind, but based on the evidence so far, some of this new work, there is a way forward. There is a way forward in thinking about the types of targeted social programs that might reduce violence. There's a way forward in thinking of the role that democracy may be playing in improving policy. And I really hope that we can advance the discussion. It's my hope as a scholar that by working together across disciplines with policymakers, that we can make a positive contribution in thinking about the next step. That we can think about creatively about the types of policy reforms that can make a difference, the hope being that instead of a continent covered with conflict, we can wipe clean the map and think that maybe 30 years from now, the next generation won't have the kind of violence and instability that the last 30 years has seen. Thank you very much.